Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated economist here. Wanted to share this article with you guys. Link is down in the description. It's talking about the wave of foreclosures. And this is something that I think a lot of us were anticipating when we first heard about the forbearance, is that we thought this wave of foreclosures would start bringing a lot more inventory onto the housing market and therefore driving down the prices. This is something that I had said, right when I first heard about the forbearance kicking in. However, that's not quite what happened. And what's taking place right now, although we have a rise in foreclosures, you got to think this is comparing it to what was taking place like a year ago when there was no foreclosures in the market. So even if you doubled the amount of foreclosures, it's still pretty low to the amount of foreclosures that, say, took place during or after the great financial crisis, where there was just tons of foreclosures happening. Really, right now, we have very low amount of homes that are actually being foreclosed on, although the rate is starting to increase. What I'm anticipating is happening here is that most people are probably just restructuring their loan. Like if you had a home loan that you stopped making the mortgage payments on, and now it's time to come out of forbearance, and you did not save all the back payments so that you could make them all up at once, then you have to restructure your loan. And restructuring your loan just basically means that you're going to just take out another mortgage again for 30 years, and that'll generally lower your payments, especially if you had some payments built up already. So going into foreclosure is probably not something that is going to happen for most homeowners out there. Now, if you can't restructure and you didn't have all the back payments and you're still in financial hardships, most likely you are going to go into foreclosure, right? I mean, if you can't restructure and you can't make your payments, then you lose your home. But with the elevated house prices that we have experienced over the last, few years, like the extreme house price increases, most likely you're not having an underwater like you're not underwater on your home, meaning that if you sold it today, that you would most likely be able to sell it for a profit and be able to even walk away from your house. Even after not making payments for the last 2 years, you can make up all the payments, what you owed on the house, and still walk out with a little bit of money. I mean, that is a very real possibility for a lot of people out there. So again, like bringing the home prices down due to the foreclosures that are out there, I don't see it happening from people like just trying to get out of that foreclosure just by selling their house. Okay, so the house probably would never even make it to foreclosure before it got sold. But let's say it does go into foreclosure, okay? And now it's going to be like, county auction or something like that. The amount of inventory out there is so low, and the amount of cash buyers out there is so big that even if these homes were to make it to auction, the few of them that do make it through the foreclosure and get into auction, I would imagine that there is probably so many people out there who are willing to pay cash for a house that they would end up driving those auction priced homes up, even up to market value, just simply so they could find a home to get into. So again, I don't see where the foreclosure or the rising foreclosures at this point is going to drive home prices down. The only thing that I see that could really drive home prices down is going to be the lifting of interest rates. And that's at the Fed funds level. I mean, this is the Federal Reserve going to raise interest rates on the... A lot of people, when they hear like the Fed's going to raise interest rates, what they are doing is they are going to put a target on the wall saying this is what we're shooting for. And then hopefully they can conduct their banking system in such a way that the big banks on their overnight lending would achieve that target rate. That's ultimately what it comes down to. And so when the Federal Reserve says that they want to raise interest rates, what they want to do is make the interest rates that these big banks lend to each other on an overnight basis, they want to raise that. In turn, all interest rates from that point on will begin to rise as well. Now, ultimately, if you want to know where the interest rates are going to go, follow the 10-year. Follow the 10-year Treasury, because that's pretty much the benchmark for all loans out there. Wherever the 10-year goes, all loans go. So if the 10 years, the yields on the 10-year starts to rise, then you're going to find credit cards, car loans, house loans, everything that you take out there as far as a loan goes, those ones are going to start to rise as well. So going back to the Federal Reserve and the lifting of interest rates, at the same time that they raise these interest rates, they're going to start messing around with their balance sheet, which is also going to start messing with the interest rates as well. Now, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve ultimately has U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities on it. Now, these mortgage-backed securities, over the last 2 years or whatever it was during the quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve has been purchasing a lot of these mortgage-backed securities, like, $40 billion worth a month, which puts a buyer in the market. When you have a buyer in the market, then the rest of the market who is out there buying mortgage-backed securities, like all the investors or pensions or whoever it is that's buying these mortgage-backed securities, they look at the Federal Reserve and that gives them confidence. They're like, hey, if the Federal Reserve is going to be buying these mortgages, then we know that we have a buyer of them. That gives us a lot of confidence to go ahead and purchase these things, because if we ever go to sell them, there's a definite buyer in the market. Hey, that's pretty cool. So when it comes to mortgage-backed securities and you have the Federal Reserve who is stepping up to the plate saying, hey, we're a buyer at $40 billion a month, that's going to keep the prices on those mortgage-backed securities incredibly elevated and the interest rates really low. This in turn finds its way into the housing market, because if you can keep the mortgage-backed security yields low, then the yields for the homeowner themselves who are taking out the loan, those interest rates that they pay is much lower. If those mortgage-backed securities do not have a buyer of them, then what ends up happening is the price on those starts to increase and the yields on them starts to diminish. And if you do not have the Federal Reserve up in there buying those mortgages, now you've got the market saying, hey, this may not be as liquid of a market as we had anticipated. And this is really where the concern starts to find itself as far as the housing market goes. Because if you cannot find a very liquid mortgage market, like you could find buyers in and out of this mortgage-backed security market with no problems at all, because the Federal Reserve was there, but if they're not there and you have issues with this, or at least concerns, then that's risk that you're taking on. And as the risk begins to rise, so does the reward, meaning that the yield that they pay. Right? So this is really where it starts to come in, is that if the Federal Reserve actually sells those mortgages, like they're like, hey, we're getting out of this thing, we're selling these things off, not only do you not have a buyer in the market who is providing liquidity, but they are actually taking liquidity out of the market. And even if they decide not to sell, just by simply allowing mortgages to roll over, like if somebody was to refinance or say pay that mortgage, pay those mortgages off, those mortgage-backed securities can become extinguished. That means that the Federal Reserve got that money back. And if they don't turn that into another mortgage-backed security, like rolling it over into another one, which they say they're not going to do, then that's more liquidity coming out of the market. That's even less transactions happening there, which means that there is more risk, which means that the prices come down and the yields continue to go up. So this is the scenario that we really have to follow. I mean, watch what the Federal Reserve does. I do not think that the Federal Reserve will actually go into a position in which that they will sell mortgage-backed securities. I do not believe that. I think what the Federal Reserve will do is just to naturally allow those mortgage-backed securities to roll off their balance sheet. Either way, it's still going to be pulling liquidity out of the market. And this is something that we should be very concerned about for the next couple of years. I mean, there's plenty of liquidity in the market right now from all the money printing that they have done. But I'll even leave a link down in there for an article talking about commodities and how the liquidity for commodities is starting to find itself less available, is all I can say. And this is where like the major concern starts to take place. Like, how easy can you get in and out of this market? If it becomes difficult, that's risk. And with risk comes reward, and the reward is higher yields. Think about that. All right. Uneducated economist, you guys let me know.